chapters 7 and 8 of Aristotle's Poetics. So we've seen in the last video, check that out if you haven't already, that we're talking all about tragedy, right? Mimesis of action, right? Mimesis of an action. And the soul of tragedy is one of the 6 elements. Remember, there was all kinds of things like character and language and all that stuff, spectacle. There's 6 parts to a tragedy, and the soul of tragedy is plot. So in chapter 7 and 8, Aristotle's going to talk more about plot. And Aristotle's laying down the rules here, right? So he's talking like a boss, right? He's saying something like, although I don't write tragedies, at least as far as we know, he didn't really. He wrote some dialogues, but those seem to be lost. Although they were in antiquity, they were praised as being quite elegant, like that of Plato. But as far as I know, Aristotle really doesn't credit it with writing like tragedies and all that kind of stuff. But he's laying down the rules about how they should be written. So he studies the great works and infers these structures that he sees in them, and then lays them down as this is how you do it. So again, now back to the story here. Mimesis of an action, and he says that an action is a whole of some magnitude. So that's what plot is, and tragedy is trying to capture, right? An imitation of a whole with some magnitude. Now, Aristotle, like the good philosopher he is, he's going to break all this down. And this is, again, like a master, he just kind of throws this out. And it's really interesting. It's stuff for us we mere mortals to think about. Okay, so we have a whole of some magnitude. That's basically what an action is. So let's look at this a little bit more abstractly. So what's a whole, and what is a whole, and what do we mean by magnitude? Well, a whole is something, and in the general sense, don't think immediately of a physical thing, like like a soul is a whole, something that is whole, a unity, if you like. It has separable parts. But these parts might be separable only via reason alone, or in actuality. So let's look at a concrete whole just to get a little bit of an idea. Like over here, I have an apple, right? Now you notice the apple has, it has a certain shape, and use your mind's eye that let's say it's red, or maybe it's a green Granny Smith apple. Don't really care. So it has shape and color. So I can talk about those. I could talk about the color of the apple. I could talk about its shape, right? We could do all kinds of things with the shape in our minds, right? We could mathematically model the shape. We could mix up, or we could we could mathematically model the shape. We could talk about the color. We could mix up, paints and whatever to compare it with the color. But what we can't actually do in reality, outside of our minds, that outside of splitting the separable parts via reason alone, outside of that, we can't actually peel the color off of the apple and the shape and say, here's the shape over here and here's the color. We can't, or lay them on the table. We can't really do that. So this is a concrete object, and we pull its parts out. Even though they're concrete, we can abstract from them in our mind, that is, and talk about the parts separately. Okay, so it's separable parts via reason alone, and some other wholes, may actually have parts that you can physically separate, right? Because they have parts here, like the skin and the flesh of the apple, right? You peel apples, so you can peel the skin off. So you can do that in action. Yes, you can lay the apple skin on the table, and maybe, like we do in a fruit salad, sometimes you'll peel the skin off and then cut the fruit up and throw it, the flesh of the fruit, and throw it in a salad. So we actually can separate those, not just mentally in our minds by reason, but physically as well. So some wholes you can, if they're concrete wholes, they would have parts that you can't separate in actuality, and some parts that you can. So start, loosening your mind up to think about wholes in different ways. Now, this whole, of course, has a magnitude, right? You can see it, right? You can touch it, taste it, and all that. And again, like a soul, that would be an incorporeal soul. It wouldn't have a magnitude in the sense of that you can see it, right? You might be able to talk about parts of the soul, which Aristotle does in his work on the soul, or De Anima, the Latin name that we often use for it. He talks about parts of the soul, and those parts, he says, are ones that can only be separated via reason alone and not in actuality. Okay, so loosen your mind up to think about wholes. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But again, a tragedy has to be the mimesis of an action that is a whole, but it has to have some magnitude, right? And it has to be there, right, to be taken in by the senses. All right, so a little bit more on wholes. Wholes, in the way they lend themselves to this artwork, they have three parts in the abstract sense, like a whole, and you can see sort of smuggling in a notion of time here. So a whole has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And a beginning naturally has, or in some translations it's a little stronger, must have, by definition, a beginning must have something that follows it, right? So a beginning, by definition, really is something that has something that follows it. It'd be odd to talk about, well, that's the beginning and then nothing happened after. That's kind of weird. But you can say, well, that was the beginning and a lot of stuff happened before, but that's the beginning. So I made a little chart here. So the beginning naturally has something that follows it, but it may or may not have something that preceded it, right? So we often use, the beginning of the Second World War is not the beginning of time or anything like that. But it would be odd again to say it was the beginning of something and nothing else happened after. That would be weird. The middle is something, naturally has something before it and something afterwards. So the beginning is kind of like the head part, and it has something like a neck or a tail. The middle is exactly what you would think like in an organism. It's got to have something before it and something after. So it's like maybe a belly or a stomach, right? It's got to have a head and legs. And then the end, it's odd to say, well, that's the end, and then more stuff happens. Well, not part of the story. That's the end of the story. It's over. But you would say, well, yeah, but if this is the end, what happened before that, right? Okay, so it has these natural parts. And again, remember, think about our thing with an apple. When you're actually watching a tragedy on stage, you might not be able to really clearly say where all the lines are between the beginning, middle, and an end. Right? It's kind of seamless, and that's part of the beauty. And we'll talk about beauty in a second, of the order of the object, that it's maybe only separable in your mind, but not completely in your regular experience of taking in the tragic work. All right. So now what's important here is that, as I said at the beginning of the video, Aristotle's laying down the rules, right? He looks at these artworks and he lays down the rules, and he's saying that these are abstract sorts of restrictions. These are actual restrictions on a plot. You can't start plots arbitrarily. You can't end them arbitrarily, right? There are, according to Aristotle, there's rules on this. So art is, well, good art, right, is rule governed. So it's not just pure creativity or whatever. There are rules to this. It is, not surprisingly, art is a craft, right? It is not just, that sort of romantic notion of people, this just comes, out of their heads ex nihilo, and they just produce this material. No, it's a craft, and it has to be, and it's a rule-governed enterprise. And I mentioned something about, the notion of beauty. Aristotle also says beauty has, order and parts, and in that sense, it, like he says, anything like beauty, like a living creature, has order and parts in a concrete sense. It's not an abstract. It has magnitude. So here we go. There's the magnitude. It has to have some magnitude. In other words, being taken in by the senses. But this notion of the magnitude that a tragedy and a work of art has to have is connected to our senses, right? Because Aristotle says, if something is too tiny, it can't really have a magnitude to us because we can't see it. If something is too short, like a musical piece or whatever, you can't really hear it, and also magnitude goes the other direction. If something is actually too small, it doesn't really have magnitude for us. If something's too big, it doesn't really have magnitude for us, in the sense of, because the senses can't really take it in, right? So there is sort of the Goldilocks, shall we say, zone for our senses as well, where something has a magnitude. It's not too small, not too big, right? And also, when you think about artworks, like a play shouldn't go on too long, right? You start losing track of things, right? The magnitude is too great. Maybe there's too much to remember or whatnot. So there are a number of things that are built in to make the work of art work. That it's beautiful, that it's structured properly, and all these things. And it is related to us. So in that sense, beauty is not just simply in the mind of the beholder, because it's not just simply my abilities that determine magnitude, but the human nature, shall we say, that will determine magnitude. So we can all enjoy something in the same way and regard it as a good work of art, but it's going to be contingent on how we appropriate things. Okay, so it's going to have something that's taken in with the senses, and the same thing again. Length of a story can't be too long because it's got to be able to be within the boundaries of human memory. So if you look throughout the Poetics, Aristotle will say that there are kind of natural unities, and like a epic poetry can go over long distance of time. But then the magnitude will be less. It'll be less, less stuff that you have to remember, and so the magnitude can go down, so the length can go longer. If there's more stuff going on, the time will have to be shorter. So Aristotle thinks there's a lot of relationships, and he says in various parts that, like, the length of a tragedy really should only be like one day. Not that you actually see a performance that's one day, but the length of the story should only be about a day. Epic poetry can be much longer. And these notions of natural unities, although Aristotle doesn't stress them too much, some translations make them sound more dogmatic than others. It certainly had a huge influence. Right. So even in the days of Shakespeare, they were talking about how Shakespeare broke the rules of Aristotelian natural unities in tragedies, right? And how dare he do that? Think about Macbeth. That one goes on. The story itself is on stage is quite short, but it's over a long time period. So and people thought this was terrible, that we were breaking natural Aristotelian unities. So as they say, the dead hand of Aristotle, lies on a lot of subsequent history. But in any case, it's not clear that Aristotle is quite laying it down as strict. But he thinks in the end, though, that there are structures that should be followed in order to construct a good plot. All right. So again, as I mentioned, unities. Well, in chapter 8, there's more of a discussion of a unity of a plot. Remember, it's the mimesis. Tragedy again is the mimesis of an action, and a plot is trying to capture this kind of story, right? And it's ordered, and it's whole. It's got magnitude, and in this one, but it doesn't center on a person. And Aristotle makes some interesting comments on various poets. Like, inferior poets don't really get this. They confuse kind of like story with the life of, right? But when Aristotle says, if you think about it, in a person's life, there's, and I use the little infinity symbol here, there's infinitely many things going on. Infinitely many, he says, or just lots and lots and lots, that can't be reducible to a presentable unity. Like, a life may have a unity, but Aristotle says it's not something that can be simply presented. Well, one of his favorite poets, of course, is Homer, and he says that Homer was good at recognizing that the story of Odysseus is not the same as the life of Odysseus, right? So there's lots and lots of things that happen to Odysseus that we don't put in the story. That's not part of the general mimesis of the action of Odysseus, right? The action, though, is something smaller. It's complete. And this is the brilliance of a poet that can sort of distill this from life. And in poetry, though, as Aristotle can say, it's even broader than life. But that's for the next chapter, where he offers us more philosophical notions of poetry and contrasts poetry and history. So it's not the case that poetry is just doing history. It's doing something much more than history does. But that's for another video. So art and tragedy, we can see here, has a certain perfection to it, right? And in other words, that the art is, and in the sense of tragedy, that its mimesis of the action is complete. And it means that it's got, the beginning, middle, and an end. It's got magnitude. And if you have a really good piece of work, it's complete in the sense that it's perfect. It doesn't mean that it's the absolute best of all possible things, but it's the best that it can be, such that, and the best that it can be really is unpacked as, like if you say, oh, this was a perfect pizza. You don't mean it's the most perfect thing in the world. You just say something like, if you would have, this perfect pizza, if it would have been cooked any longer, it would have come out dry. If it would have been cooked any less, the dough wouldn't have been done. If there had been a different if you were to add more toppings, it'd be too much. If you were to take any toppings away, it'd be too little. The idea of perfection in this sense and completion is that any adding or subtracting, you can't do that without ruining or denigrating it, right? So the perfect pizza is just as it is. You can't make it any better. And if you try, you're only going to make it worse. All right, so this notion of art having a perfectionism in it, that's a very kind of Greek concept of the notion of completeness and perfection. And you find that throughout the history of philosophy. The notions of perfection and all that will come up in medieval theology. It comes up in Descartes and Locke, and on to Kant and his aesthetics, which we'll treat of in another video. So that wraps up 7 and 8. But as I said, Aristotle is not done philosophizing about art, and in the next chapter he's going to talk more about philosophy and the role of the poet versus the historian. But stay tuned for that.